Hello gang, Mr. Ed here with another episode of Mr. Ed Makes. And in this episode, it is kind of a part 2 to a previous episode where I made the Miura-Ori Origami fold. And I made it kind of a larger scale to demonstrate how it's folded. And in this episode, I'm going to take that scale down another level of tessellation. This is footage of the previous episode, and you can find a link to that down in the description, and you'll also find a link to this at the end of the video. And then I just left it plain white, just so you can kind of see how the light will shade it in different ways depending on the angles. In this episode, I'm going to texture it with color. I'm going to use a resist technique, and these series of photos, these were taken from the video, and then I've processed them in Photoshop. And you can see that just the photographs you can take from this paper is really beautiful. So making art out of it should prove to be very fruitful. So in the previous episode, I explained how you can fold this uniformly along the vertical and the horizontal. And then when you get to the diagonals, you have to kind of double up. And once you get down to this scale, you have to really be precise, and you can see, even though I've sped this up, I'm taking a lot of time to make sure this is folded as accurately as possible. In fact, I couldn't tape it, I couldn't videotape me doing it because I have to hang over it and get really close to make sure that the seams all line up as you fold. So if you make any mistakes, it's really going to show up at the end, especially at this level. The diagonals are really narrow, and because they're so narrow and you've folded the paper so many times, when you start to fold on the diagonal, the paper will actually arc. It gets this curve to it because of how the paper stretches. So I'm always concerned about making sure that I don't impart this Ark Bias on the rest of the fold. So I always kind of have to fight with it to get it to fold as evenly as possible. And then when you get to the actual folding in these mountains and valleys, in the larger scale, it's relatively easy, but it's still really challenging. When you get to this scale, it can make you ill trying to just be so delicate and patient, trying to get this paper to pop. Not only get it to move the way you want it, but to see how actually it needs to move, because it can be tricky. You have all these different lines. Some of them aren't actually used. They will show up in the flat surfaces of the mountains. There'll be a diagonal line that comes down, because you're essentially just working with all kinds of triangles at this point. And some of the triangles line up to make parallelograms, and that's where you get this really cool kind of Cubert. Anybody remember the game Cubert? If you don't, Google it. There's this trick of geometry that the eye sees. It starts to see planes that don't exist and surfaces that aren't really there. It's a really neat effect. And then when you start to color it, one of the things that I wanted to do was create this texture, this really organic texture that contrasts the geometry. And the idea in my mind was that as a person looks at it under certain angles, the organic geometry would stand out, and you would kind of lose these facets. You wouldn't be able to see them as well. And then if the light hits it at a certain angle, you can see the facets, and the organic geometry just seems to be overlaid onto the more linear geometry. And this juxtaposition I thought would be really interesting from a viewer standpoint, and just to try to create. So one of the ways to create this organic texture was to use a resist, so they can get a nice, a strong gradient to where parts of it are really light. It's not going to take up the color as much, and other parts are going to really take up the color. And when I've made these in the past, I've had a tendency to add way too much color, so I'm kind of dialing it back. So for this one, I decided to go for kind of like a metallic, sort of rusted metal look, and depending on how you color it, I've actually used wood stain to color this, and when you put the facets into it, people have asked, is that wood? I mean, it surprises them that it's paper sometimes. So I've often taken to making different color combinations and trying to make these faux textures. So for this one, I went for kind of an oxidized metal look. So whenever you apply the color, of course the paper is going to stretch, it's going to flatten out, and there's this fear. When I first tried this, you spend 90 minutes or so folding this paper, and to the point where it's made you ill, and now you're going to put water on it and risk losing all of these beautiful folds you've just put into this paper. But if you've really pressed it out and creased it well, it's going to stay. It's like pleated pants. So even though you put all this color and glue and resist or whatever you use on it, as long as you kind of get to it before it completely dries and it's still kind of soft, you can push back all the mountains and valleys and almost kind of push it together. Now you want to be careful, because if it's glue like I've used, if you push it together, it's going to stick and it'll tear when you pull it apart. So you just kind of want to put the mountains and valleys that have fallen out back into it and kind of press it together gently. And I let it dry that way. And then once it's dry and stiff, then you can go in and recrease everything. And I know this sounds like a giant pain, but sometimes, especially if you use a resist on there, it stiffens the folds, and you have to go back through and fold all of the horizontals both ways, all the verticals both ways, the diagonals both ways twice, and it's really time consuming. It's definitely worth the time and effort, because you can see they're awesome. I've sold many. I have collectors who really appreciate it just for the beauty of it, and it's a great conversation piece, because it's kind of hard to tell how it's created, and with this video it kind of takes away maybe a little bit of the magic. I don't know. You can see how it's made, and you can maybe even try it yourself if you want to, because it is fun, even though it does take a lot of time and it's kind of tedious and repetitious. But so is like knitting and whatever, and you can make some really cool stuff that way too. So give it a try. It's not really that hard. If you do give it a try, let me know. I would love to see it. I would love to hear about it. If you don't, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you want to see how the first level of tessellation is made, click the video link here. Click my face if you'd like to subscribe to this channel and see upcoming videos where I create a background for this and put it in a double matted frame. I also have a luminary I'm going to make using this paper, so click the bell, click subscribe, be notified. Thank you for watching, and until next time, bye-bye.